Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, everyone, for your patience as I work through technology issues on my side. I'm not going to push my luck with a slide deck for that very reason. I had to change machines midway, owing to the experience I think many of us are having as we try to do distributed, disembodied work. Right? The limits of the technology have become quite visible and tangible to us as many of us work from home in significant degree thanks to COVID. And I am not an exception. Okay, so new machine wanted to update, et cetera, et cetera. If only, as Dan points out, the worker was as easy to move around as the work. Yeah. What I'm going to do very quickly, and I'm not going to set my timer actually because I don't trust it as the whole thing, but I will keep my eye on time. I will apologize in advance for not having time this previously. But I am going to try to move very quickly through the setup for some of my recent work, and then talk about some preliminary findings as my research assistant and I have been pulling them. My story here, my intervention begins with how AI, arguably best understood as the ghost in the machine, borrowing there from Gray and Surrey's book on ghost work, obfuscates and subsumes the human beings and the social relations that produce work, something that Dan has also pointed out quite elegantly. It also does something else. It is a model that thus far has been incompatible with the way many workers are actually doing work and situated economic activity. And that is a focus of my research. In particular, our focus on what AI can do to make work tasks more efficient, for example, completely ignores and is irrelevant to the sort of everyday experience of workers who have found that a significant part of their income comes from what I call non-job work. Right? Non-job work is that work that actually platforms have made both more democratically accessible to more workers, while simultaneously shifting the balance of power from labor to management. So the technology produces and is part of the political economy of the weakening of jobs at the same time that it arguably provides points of access for more and more people to do non-job work. That's the platforms, right? That's Ubering, that's Instacarting, and a whole host of other platform mediated non-job work. As it turns out, non-job work is precisely the kind that minority workers are more likely to take on in response to labor market discrimination, and the kind of technologically assisted production and consumer demand mismatch that results in some of the things Dan was just talking about, scheduling and income volatility. So not only does the focus, sort of narrow focus on how AI can make workers more efficient, sort of obscure our focus and attention to non-job work. In so doing, it also obscures and invisibilizes a significant part of everyday economic activity where minority workers are generating and experiencing their work. So minority workers increasingly turn to small cap, single employee, micro entrepreneurship as an individuated response to these hostile conditions. They're less likely to have labor market returns to their education credentials. Should they actually procure those credentials? Their credentials have less elasticity on the labor market, makes it more difficult for them to do the kind of horizontal career development that Dan describes, where one does individual career promotion and creates an individual job ladder by moving from firm to firm. One thing that helps workers do that is a credential that the labor market will recognize as such. Minority workers have a harder time both earning that credential and getting that credential to pay off. If they are lucky enough to secure job-based work, they are more likely to be concentrated in lower wage parts of the firm, and to pay a higher cost for job access and job mobility in the experience of racial, gender, and class bias and discrimination. So they're more likely to be pushed into non-job work. and into micro entrepreneurship. And that's that, again, really small cap, single employee entrepreneurial activity that doesn't quite level up to the level of what we think of as a small business, but that is entrepreneurial and organized around an entrepreneurship logic. So I'll be using and drawing an example from my research of African-American women micro entrepreneurs from a study that I'm calling the Hustle Studies. It's supported by a grant from Filene's Research Initiative, who is interested in how women and women of color interact with financial technologies or fintech in the non-job economy. And as Dan points out, machine learning is both a technology and a technique in the critical theory sense of the gig economy, which I call and refer to as the hustle economy. And I do that quite deliberately. I do that because the gig economy has, I think, narrowed our imagination in some ways about the historical sediments that shape this non-job work of our current economy. As Dan points out, there's a racialized history to what type of work is considered both legitimate or the type of work that is most likely to be target for extraction and expropriation. And that's a racialized history. And I think relocating it in the hustle economy is my way of signaling that racialized history. That is part of my larger project of racializing platform capitalism as a theoretical project. I will describe briefly some of the findings from the Hustle study project that started just as COVID shutdowns were happening. But all of those findings are loosely under one finding, and that is that the hybridity that's been mentioned on our panel so far today, that AI makes possible and makes efficient and legible, is conditioned on one's racial and embodied capital. And that when you consider the racial and embodied capital that people bring to those interactions, you get a very different sort of interpretation of the possibilities of micro work activities, and micro entrepreneurship as a case study for that. So in this work, I draw on feminist and anti-colonial theories of racial capitalism, in particular Bhattacharya's work on racial capitalism. And I situated in conversation with the fast-growing work on platform capitalism. The empirical case for this theory building that I'm undertaking right now considers the non-job work of Black US women on non-auction social media platforms. So these aren't women who are on Etsy, which is designed to do economic activity. They're actually doing economic activity in the shadows of social media platforms that are arguably designed for developing weak social ties. And they leverage that into and exploit platform affordances to turn it into a site of economic activity. This micro entrepreneurial labor is indicative of the Western iteration of global hustling economies that graft onto localized racial, gender, class, and embodied hierarchies to extract and expropriate material and immaterial surplus value to the benefit of the least precarious populations at the expense of the more precarious populations. And this part is key for me. With very limited exceptions, precarity and risk is just a condition of the current political economy, and we are all experiencing it. And our experience of it is relational. It's related to how other people are able to experience it. So the data from our pilot study has three guiding interests. I'm interested in doing a descriptive analysis first that surfaces the economic activity, the knowledge production, the affect and the services that are happening among micro entrepreneurial hustlers in the platform economy. I'm interested in locating sites of racial difference in micro entrepreneurial strategies. So does race matter to the types of hustling strategies, financial technologies, and forms of economic activity that happen through platform affordances? And because this is fundamentally a feminist project, I'm interested in troubling the binary. That's what feminists do. And the binary here that I'm interested in troubling is that material immaterial binary, the one that I again think gets obscured when we focus very narrowly on AI and the future of work, that there's material work and immaterial work. From a feminist lens, it is all work, and that binary can, in certain circumstances, obscure more than it elucidates. All right, so this is what happened. I had this idea that we were going to talk to Black women who were hustling online. We start this project about 2 months before the very first COVID shutdown started to happen at the state level. My moment, the inflection point for me was when the NBA canceled the NBA finals. And as it turned out, I ended up talking to these women just as COVID was impacting their lives. And a couple of things that I'll move through very quickly. I'm sorry about time. I think I have just a couple of minutes there. Let's see. The first is that I asked all of these women to do an entrepreneurial self-narrative, to take me through their work day, both their employed work and their non-job work. And one of the first things that is important is that, similar to other stories of minority entrepreneurs, almost all of the women in my sample also had paid job-based work. Right? Which suggests that what is happening in the micro entrepreneurial space for them is that it is an escape valve for precisely the kind of labor market patterns that Dan was discussing earlier. They're using it to augment either their ability to make more money or to increase their professional status or to develop a professional status and identity that they hope will translate into their job-based work. For some of them in that entrepreneurial self-narrative, they talked about inheriting their hustle from a grandparent or an elder relation, but all of them talked to a generalized sense of racism and inequality, pushing them into micro entrepreneurship. That's really consistent with research among Black entrepreneurs that cites white racial violence and workplace discrimination as reasons for starting businesses. That's quite different than the narrative of the Silicon Valley tech incubator narrative, which is one about leading and reshaping the future of work. These entrepreneurs are more likely to be responding to the very real material conditions of work as it presently exists. COVID ended up being a useful backdrop for thinking about the way firms as platforms, to borrow Cernick's formulation, obscures how the racializing differentiation happens on platforms. So I'll use the example of the financial technology that was most popular with the women in navigating Instagram's inability to do payment transactions on that platform. They used external third-party financial technologies, the most popular of which was Cash App. Cash App, as one respondent told me, is really popular because it's hood, and it, she says, appears in a lot of pop and hip hop songs. So it has diffuse awareness, right? People know about Cash App. It is also one of the easiest to sign up for, which matters because most of the people who with whom Cash App is popular have experienced discriminatory access to mainstream commercial banking services. So they were running their businesses using Cash App because it's what their consumers understood. It allowed them to get around Instagram's platform affordances. You can drop a Cash App link in the DMs and use that as your payment system. When however, the CARES Act was introduced, the significant part of that being the Payroll Protection Program, or the PPP, was rolled out. It was in theory designed precisely for the kind of micro entrepreneurs who were working both a job-based work and non-job-based work, the kinds of women that I was speaking to. And it really showed how this rollout happened, and their experience of it really highlights the importance of thinking about these things through a racial capitalism lens. The PPP guaranteed forgivable loans to provide liquidity to small and mid-sized businesses to prevent job losses. So exactly the kind of small cap micro businesses that these women specialized in. It was administered through the SBA with a loan application process that very quickly was dominated by commercial banks. So this means that the historical relationship that African-American women have with commercial banks becomes a point of differentiation. If you do not have access to a loan officer or a banking officer, you do not have a relationship with a commercial banking entity, or you have a history of negative experiences with commercial banks. If you look at things like the housing crisis and the foreclosure crisis and its impact on African-Americans during the last recession, a significant portion of African Americans have that kind of negative history. It made them unlikely or unable to qualify for the relationship necessary to access a PPP loan. But for some of the women who were able to access the PPP loan process, Very quickly, what they found out was that Cash App didn't qualify as a secure documentation as revenue, as business revenue. It did not meet the administrative determination for a profit and loss statement to prove that they were businesses and they were doing legitimate business activity. So using the financial technology that was most embedded in the racialized logics of accessing consumers and products on Instagram, Cash App, they had simultaneously engaged with a financial technology that invisibilized that revenue when it came time to interact with the state to access social policy interventions. This is indicative of the way the social relations of financial tech platforms are embedded in these racialized histories and how they can become invisible in how we think about those relationships. The PPP program highlighted the role of the state in legitimizing micro-entrepreneurial activity. The respondents who applied experienced, however, that differentiation as individuals and were left on their own to sort of make sense of why this had happened. And when they did that, they started to pull from these ideas that are embedded in racial ideas of worth, value, being middle class enough, sufficiently professionalized enough to qualify for the PPP loans. The hustlers in my story did not have the economic capital to produce like a competitive Etsy storefront. So they ended up doing their micro entrepreneurial activity on a platform that surfaced the cultural capital of them being women and women of color, but simultaneously made them visible to the mechanisms of economic inclusion, the likes of which we increasingly rely on to make the future of work, quote unquote, more equitable in there. Thanks.
Thank you, Tressie. Very interesting set of thoughts. We'll come back to it at the end.